Hello, hello. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Woman. Good evening, everyone. My name is Melanie McNair. I'm the Senior Director of Public Programming here at the Center for Fiction. Thank you all for joining us for this really exciting event. How many of you are visiting us for the first time tonight? Oh my goodness, so many of you. Please check out our website. We're the only literary nonprofit that focuses on the creation and enjoyment of fiction, and we do that through events like this. We also have an amazing Emerging Writing Fellow program where we give people 9 unpublished fiction writers money, a space to write, mentorship, and monthly meetings with publishing professionals for 9 months. And that if you are one of those people, or if you know anybody, the applications are now open for that until May 31st. So the only requirement is that you're based in New York City and you haven't published a book of fiction yet. So check that out. Tonight is part of our National Endowment of the Arts Big Read celebration. This year, as you all know, we're reading Circe together. During the dark days of the pandemic, I did an event with Dahvana, Headley, and Madeline Miller, and Emily Wilson, and that's when I discovered how excited people are about re-examining these old Western myths and flipping things around and destroying the binaries and seeing who really is the hero and who's really the monster. So I've been really looking forward to this, and I'm sure you have been too. Just a note, you can probably tell we're having little tech issues with our video wall, so that's why we've got this set up. And I think you all got an email, but just so you know, Madeline and Maria are joining us remotely. They're gonna fill your brains with knowledge anyway. And we're really thrilled to have both of them, as well as Nataly and Rachel. And I'm gonna go ahead and bring y'all up, and let's get this party started. Thank you. Sorry. Hello.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to be here. I am a huge Greek mythology fan, so this is as much for me as it is for you. I'm so excited to talk with all 3 of you. You all have such great books and retellings. And the first thing I wanted to ask about is I feel like a lot of retellings, the work is recontextualizing a lot of the people. So you're working to bring out Circe, Demeter, Beowulf, Grendel's mother. Who are they in your book? And so I wanted to ask, when you were bringing these characters into your own retelling, was there a vital moment when you were writing where you said this needs to be in the context so you can have the reader sympathize with them in a new way? Even if they're monsters, even if they're making decisions you don't agree with, what was the one thing that you said, I need to write this in this book? Who wants to go first?
Maria, are you about to jump in?
I can go first. Yeah, we can't see you guys on stage, just so you know. There's probably some sort of glitch happening, so we can't take any visual cues from you. Just so you know.
That is helpful to know.
I think you also read the introductions, but which we couldn't hear, which is why we did not seem like we were listening. It's because we couldn't hear it. So sorry about that.
We just started talking at you. I'm so sorry.
Recording in progress.
And in that moment, I forgot the gist of the question. I'm so embarrassed. Oh, we can see you now. Okay, I feel much better.
Hello.
Hi. Okay, now we can greet each other. We can know each other's souls a little bit. Hi.
Okay, yeah. So the question was, when you were writing the story, when you were bringing the characters into your own retelling, was there a vital moment that you said, I need to bring this to the character to give them a new context, to give them a new life in your retelling?
Okay, yes. I wanted to talk, because I think this is relevant to everybody's book here, including yours, Nataly. just the fact of bringing something into close POV is different from any of the mythological sources. It's like bringing something into either first or into a close third, which all of these books have, inherently makes it feel non-fable. It makes it feel real. So when I was working on The Mere Wife, I used a whole bunch of different POVs in that book. I used like a first-person POV. I used a really close third-person POV. I used a sort of collective POV, and all of it was an attempt to create intimacy with the distance source material, which is, whatever it is, 1,000 years old. Like, okay, how can I make this feel relevant and contemporary just using the voice? And that was one of the most important choices that I made. And I just was rereading the beginnings of everyone's books and looking at everyone else's choices in that regard, and it seemed to me that everyone kind of had a similar path. I'm so curious to hear what other people would say about this.
I feel like Madeline could go next because my book isn't necessarily like so much of a retelling as it is a sort of reimagining. So it uses Persephone and Demeter as sources for these two characters, Emer and Corey, mother and daughter, and it follows as the myth, but it's also not quite as much of a retelling as these other books are. So I'm curious what Madeline would say, and then I would love to weigh in. Yeah.
I mean, there were so many individual moments that I was enraged about in terms of Circe is portrayed in the Odyssey that I feel like I could go on all night listing them. But I feel like the heart, really what gets at the heart is the fact that she is such an object. She's this very exoticized sexual fantasy that, Odysseus is actually telling that part of the Odyssey. He's narrating it to some people he's trying to impress, the Circe episode. And so it's really him sort of spinning this PR story about himself where he looks really good because he bagged a sexy goddess and she was also a witch and really scary, but he tamed her. And, it's this whole kind of like thing going on that he's presenting, and I was really, and she kneels to him and weeps at his feet in the Odyssey, and I was like, okay, there's going to be no kneeling. We're going to hold the subjectivity out of this, absurd sexual fantasy that Odysseus is giving us. So that was kind of the heart of it.
I want your list of all of them, though. I would like them in my email at the end of the night.
I really loved that moment in the book, by the way, when she's like, there was no kneeling. There was no begging. I'm just going to tell you straightforwardly.
Yes, you can feel that was the rage I had.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think so the question is like, was there a particular thing that I wanted to bring to life?
Yeah.
For me, it was really that sort of love triangle really between a daughter and her mother and the daughter's lover, abuser, however, like depending on what version of the myth you read or what version you're telling, this complicated relationship she has with Hades, right? So the Persephone and Hades relationship is one part of it. The Persephone and Demeter part of it is another. And then at the end, there's this triangulation, it's finally fulfilled, the final leg of the triangle between Demeter and Hades. And I just find that so powerful, Freudian, like there's a lot of material to look at there and emotional material to mine. So that was really part of what I was interested in.
Yeah. And just thinking about that too, because I was really interested reading your book in that I was kind of upset with everyone at one point, especially Hades, but I was also upset with like the way Demeter was acting, especially Corey, because, young girl making stupid decisions. I'm like, you're so much smarter than this. But leading into the next question I had was about when you're retelling these stories or when you're reimagining them, like how can you justify the heroes, like in Beowulf's case, Beowulf, in Circe's case, Odysseus, in Hades and Persephone, like who really, but how can they justify their actions in the retelling? How can you make them still like a viable character going through their own story, but obviously they're not the center point anymore?
I think for all of us, probably that was one of the big challenges here, right? But so for me, I wasn't really working with a story about a monster per se in the same way that like Madeline transforms, like she brings Scylla to life, right? Which is so fun. Or Beowulf and Grendel, like this sort of epic, good and evil ideal, right? That you sort of flip on its head. But I think I was looking more at like this question of moral ambiguity. So on one hand, we have Hades is really in love with Persephone for whatever that's worth, and crosses the boundary. And on the other, and so he's kind of an antagonist, but I was really interested in mining his humanness and his vulnerability and his feelings of, what's behind a feeling of entitlement. It's a real earnestness, and so I was really interested in that. And then on the other hand, we have Demeter, his sort of late capitalist counterpart, who's also falling from grace in this way, but has this heroic hunt for her daughter at the great cost of millions of people's livelihoods and lives, right? And that's straight out of the myth, right? Demeter does go drop everything and look for Persephone, and the people of Earth starve, the crops die, like everyone's screwed, but it doesn't matter because she, I thought that was really interesting reading both of your books, like how casually the gods kind of like drop everything and act in their own self-interest.
Humans are expendable, of course.
Right. That's what makes them gods. Yeah. But we are all kind of working in that material, I think.
Yeah, I think probably all of us are interested in the guts of the Beowulf story are, what is it to be a good ruler? Can you be a good ruler? Can you be a good man? Is it possible? And in that story, it's not possible. Like, no one gets there. And it's a constant question. And the idea of being a good woman is a huge part of that too. The idea of like protecting your child, protecting your sons in the court of Hrothgar. And I think it's one of the reasons that these stories have kind of stayed really relevant to us, is that these are all the questions of being a parent, of being a member of a community, of being a member of a society. Like, what can you do with your selfish human instincts, your like hungry, selfish, goblin human instincts? It's still part of your community. Can you do it? Will it work? Will you be hurting other people? Will you be injuring your whole world? And of course, we have lots of evidence that yes, like all of this is true, that you're always injuring the community by being a hungry human goblin. Humans are always injuring the community. So how can you balance it? How can you work with that? It's something that's part of pretty much all folklore and mythology. And it's part of, I think, all of these books.
Absolutely. I totally agree with all of that. And I think that, that is so much of, I think, what we're all looking at is how to be how to live ethically in the world. Is it even possible? What are the sacrifices? What are the costs? And when I was thinking about Circe, one of the things I always think about in terms of ancient Greek literature is sort of what a hero means, because we oftentimes talk about the Greek heroes, and when we use hero in the modern context, we mean it in a positive way. We mean someone who's like a moral exemplar or virtuous, but the ancients did not use the word that way at all. Odysseus and Achilles are like wrecking balls through their respective epics. And Odysseus' name even comes from the verb meaning to be hated. And Achilles' name possibly comes from, grief to the people, bringing grief to the people. And so part of also what I wanted to do, sort of centering Circe, in her own epic story, is allow her to make disastrous mistakes, just like the men have made for the last 3,000 years. Yes. That felt really important, that she was able to have the same scope to make those messes, and then much more, I think, than they do, just because of who she is as a person. She kind of has to wrestle with those and deal with the consequences and try to pull back in places where she's made a mistake, or even it takes her a while to recognize she's made a mistake. So I'm always sort of interested. I wanted her to have that ability to be messy and hated and grief, and bring grief to people as the male heroes in Greek literature have had.
Yeah, of course. And that leads perfectly into my next question, which was, I feel like one of the great things about the retellings and the reimaginings is when you're taking a character like Circe or a character like Grendel's mother or someone like Demeter or Emer, you can give them so much space to be so much more than what they might have originally been in the myth. So what I was thinking when I was reading all of your books is how a lot of women in the myth might have been cornered into the kind of trifecta of the maiden, the mother, and the crone. So if they are one of them, they're usually not the other one. They are just one thing at a time. They can't be, expressive or angry or destructive or anything like that. If they're the mother, they must be the one thing. But since they have so much space in the retellings, I feel like they get to be at least two or all three of them. And so I wanted to know, how you think getting them to touch all of those points at once, how does it change their character in your mind while you're reading the story, where you get to see how expressive and wide their characters can be, so much more than the myths would have told us originally, you had to draw it out yourself.
Well, I think what Madeline says about, the that we get Circe's story initially in Odysseus's voice, right? We get all of these stories initially in the voices of the men who told them, right? Presumably. Yeah. We don't really know who was telling. And actually Maria speaks to that in her epigraph, I think, that it could have been a woman. But I think, this is part of the allure of the retelling or the reimagining, is that we get to allow this person to flex and shift and change and evolve and be as human and complicated as we are. And, that's what we do in contemporary literature, right? And that's the strange translation of the ancient into the contemporary, that this static, godly figure can become human. I think it's really kind of exciting to allow that to happen. But I think also what happens is that we shed the godliness, right? The character sheds its godliness as we allow it to, let's say, do really human, give birth, for instance, do human animal things, mammalian things, right? But I think we're also all writing about power and using that God animal dyad kind of idea as a way to explore ideas of power. So I was looking at late capitalism and the power that's held by the 1%, for instance. And, Maria's looking at war and systems of power that lead to global conflicts, which is, by the way, really incredible to read right now.
The book just becomes more relevant, weirdly.
It just more and more. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. I'd love to hear what you all have to say about that.
I'm jaw drop briefly. Okay, Madeline has to go first.
I think part of what I love about mythology in general is the kaleidoscopic nature of it, which is that you can just shift the things a little bit and suddenly everything falls into a new configuration and it's an entirely different narrative. And then you change something else. And again, and the ancients, the ancient Greeks love to do that. I mean, there's so many different versions of these stories and so many different perspectives. And we only have a tiny amount of the amount of stories that got told and retold. And so I feel like that kind of natural variation is so much built into what makes myth so satisfying, is that there's always another corner, always another perspective, always another way to look at it or play with it. And so that's part of what I love about it.
This is totally, it's exactly what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about the way that in the sort of history of folklore and mythology, we have just the little bits, and then we have often one-line mentions of women and one-line mentions of kind of interesting characters who would just kind of come off the page, or they do something epic and they've gone or dead or just missing from the action. In Virgil's Aeneid, we have Lavinia, who we learn that she has caught on fire, that as a sign, her whole body has caught on fire to tell everyone that she should be married to Aeneas. But then she doesn't show up again until later. She's in the woods raising their son by herself, and we don't even know what happened to Aeneas. So to me, it's really interesting, looking at the sort of different feminine roles from this point of view. I'm 46. Like I have been like the kind of everything, like the mother, the maiden, certainly. And it's been interesting to look at how they all have the same kinds of responsibilities unfairly, like the responsibility of like keeping the whole society safe in a kind of nanny-ish way to begin with, and then in a now you have to nurture and raise the society, and then now you have to give your wisdom to raising the whole, to keeping men safe at the end, like all of these sort of entwined female roles that have been throughout the history, but they haven't been like fully articulated in the stories. So to me, it's very, in these kind of desperate times that we're living in, where everything is getting reduced in terms of women being able to own their own bodies, in terms of pretty much all marginalized people getting to own their own bodies. Like, I think about how important it is to have these like articulated stories as opposed to the one-line versions of the story that say, here's a powerful role. Like the idea in our society that being a beautiful young woman is very powerful it's also very flawed power. Like it's power that like is entwined with danger, and kind of all of the roles that seem to be the powerful roles for women and marginalized people of all kinds are often also very perilous roles. And that has not been articulated really in the stories beyond just like, and then she was turned into a tree, and then she was turned into a cow, and then she just left the story. She was gone. And I think about like the one-line fragments from people like, there's like a Medea story that has 2 lines left in fragmentary form. I think about all of those little bits and pieces that I would love to see fattened out and put out into our sort of natural history of the lives of, and that's, I think, work that we're all doing bits of in our work and trying to do bits of for that reason.
Yeah, exactly. And it's my favorite thing. And there is a retelling of Lavinia by Ursula K. Le Guin that is so good. Highly recommend.
I have to note that we all have those scenes in our books of, right, like the transformation of the woman from, woman to crone, or, but it all has to do with shedding that patriarchal sort of expected image, right? We have I have Emer shaving her head and running off, like the keratin treated hair falls to the ground, and she's not wearing makeup, and she goes hunts for her daughter.
And she calls herself a crone, and I'm like, yes, ma'am.
Uses the word crone. We have Dana Mills bandaging her own arm and staggering out like the fallen hero, and we have Circe all of these characters are doing that on the page, which I think is really interesting and powerful. And I kind of wonder how influenced it is by cinema, actually, but there's a really interesting sort of common echo, I think, going on between all of these books and the way that we're moving from role to role.
Yeah, definitely. And then I feel like, especially with a feminist retelling and all 3 of you being mothers, motherhood in general was a huge theme in all 3 of your books, which I think is great, especially because, like Maria was saying, sometimes women get just so shuffled into one lane and you don't really get to see them expand on that. But the fact that all 3 of your main characters are mothers, and then they all do it differently. They're not the same kind of mother. They all get to be their own person and be a different kind of idea of what motherhood can look like. And so I think it'd be really cool to hear how you guys saw that changing the story itself, their interactions with motherhood, the way that they approached it, the way that they cared for their children or maybe didn't care for their children, and how we see them as a character going through that.
Yeah. So I had no intention of writing Demeter into my story at all initially.
Really?
It was just going to be Persephone's story.
I'm so glad she's there.
Yeah, you know what? Me too. I'm glad I made that choice eventually, but it really came from my own experience of, I started the book before I became a mother, and then I was working on it when I got pregnant and had my first child, and it was my whole conception of this character, this sort of naive, wild young woman character who's experimenting and testing the limits of her freedom, etc., my whole conception of her changed, from an interior conception to an exterior conception, where I'm looking at her suddenly as like, I'm worried about her. Like she could be my kid, So I think that was how I came to writing this character. And then, but I'm really curious about all of these versions of motherhood.
Yeah.
I don't want to take too much time on it.
Well, I had only been a step-parent by the time that I wrote The Mere Wife. I had not had a baby, like, with my own body. I'd had 2 stepchildren that I got when they were, like, 5 and 8, and raised them up into adulthood. And so I knew some of the intense sort of difficulty of being a step-parent and of being an outside parent coming in and raising kids that don't see you as their parent. And I was thinking about that in terms of the sort of unparented characters in Beowulf and the Beowulf character, but also the feeling of I could understand what it would be like to have a teenage son, because I had a teenage son. Like, and the idea of Gruender being, like, first a young boy kind of lost and wanting a friend, and he's isolated from friendships by his mother. She's keeping him safe or not inside of a mountain cave. I could easily imagine losing custody of my child that way, like having someone make a choice to, like, flee because I had two teenage children. I was like, it was very clear to me how easily someone could just get in a car and drive away. And then I had my son Grimoire. I was pregnant with him while I was translating Beowulf. So I was thinking a lot, even more, about the anguish of having someone that you built out of your bones and out of your body go into the world on their own, walking away with, like, all of construction elements that you gave to them with your teeth and with your, like, off they go. And that they're not fully built, and they can't take care of themselves. It's a little animal going out into the world, and you cannot keep them safe. So it all really entwined with that story. Like, when I was working on the translation, I was, holding my, like, 9 months. I was so pregnant when I finished it. And I was like, oh, he's coming out of the cave. And I got very, very, very grumpy.
It became literal.
I'm not going to let him out. So, yeah, it was a lot of the experience of motherhood and of caregiving went into all of my work on this stuff. And that's what made me have the idea, I think, of, like, who wrote this text, like, who made this story. Like, somebody who had some thoughts about that definitely made this story. And, lots of different kinds of people could have thoughts on parenting and caregiving, but it's a palpable and intense experience giving birth to someone.
Absolutely. And that was all of that was sort of in my mind as well. In ancient Greek literature, traditionally, women's stories are not considered important enough to be at the center of epic. And so part of what I wanted to do was to, give Circe that, as I talked about, sort of give her that scope that the male heroes had, but also to take things that in the ancient world were considered traditionally for women, like caregiving, and give them the epic treatment. Because what is more epic than caregiving for an infant? I mean, nothing. It is all-consuming. It's life and death. It's completely overwhelming. It completely rewires your entire life and brain. And so I wanted to bring that epicness from a genre sense to, how I was talking about what it was like for Circe to have to be a mother. And then also from the psychological sense of, Circe has no models for how to be a good parent. The only way she knows how to do things is alone. And so that's how she tries safely. And so that's how she tries to tackle it, which is kind of a disaster, but also she hangs in there. And, one of the things I most respect about her, and I enjoyed writing, is how she definitely makes parenting mistakes, but she never gives up trying to be better. And that really, I found that very moving to write about. That, she has no models and she's really, like, holding it together barely. even though she doesn't even have to sleep. And, unlike the rest of us. But also, I feel like writing about it from that epic perspective allowed me, just like you were saying, Maria, to talk about like that intense emotionality. Thankfully, when my kids were born, I did not have a Olympian god trying to murder them. But some people feel that way. It's like, I'm responsible for this creature's life. And it's just me, it feels like, between, me and whoever is raising the child with me. And somehow that allowed it to be big enough, like the feeling can become big enough when you're writing in the mythological world.
Yeah, definitely. And I was going to bring up the fact that not only was she raising a child who was the most animalistic, difficult child to raise, but she was also doing it while Athena was trying to kill the child. And so she's, handling two things at once. But I was really struck by that too, about how she was so, desperate to do well, and everything was against her, and somehow she still pulled it out. But then, so then the other thing I wanted to ask you all about is, Maria and I were chatting before this about how when she turned in The Mare Wife, her editor said, "Why is she so mad?" talking about Grendel's mother. Yes. So you're sitting there and you're like, why is she? We know what her son's arm got ripped off. We know why she's mad. But you're sitting there and you're like, okay, well, why is he asking? It's because we, of course, know why she's mad. We've read the story, we see what happens to her. But for someone who's coming to this story for the first time and seeing it through a feminist lens for the first time, what kind of things are you focusing on when you're seeing like her thoughts, her decisions, anything to explain, why is she so mad, to explain to someone who might not understand right away? Like, what are you trying to focus on in her thoughts that is like, okay, you are going to be mad with her now. Like, you are going to understand fully.
Well, I think just as these retellings give us an opportunity to give the epic treatment to something as epic as childbirth or parenting an infant, which really does truly feel epic. Yeah. And, it is epic to keep a person alive. They also allow us to, oh my God, I just forgot what I was going to say. Completely lost that thread.
I'm going to pass the torch and maybe it'll come back to you.
You can pass it. I've had to pass it 3 times. I think that I was looking at all of our books and thinking about the way that all of us, I think, treat, in the original epics, fate is, like, for the male hero, fate is like a get out of jail free card. The fate has made it so you have to do it like this. And even if you would rather not do the bad thing that you're about to do, fate says. So, and in none of these stories is that really the case. Like all of these characters have the thing that is like built into the structure of the narrative, the thing where it's like we know that Persephone is going to get with Hades. Like, we know it from the start. We know that's what's coming for her. This young woman, older guy looks at her. He's big, he's strong, he's powerful. She's going home with him. And home is a problem. And she isn't thinking to herself, fate says. But in the original mythology, we know that's coming for her because her fate is that. And it's interesting in the sort of way that all of us have worked with this. In Madeline's book, there's all of this fate orbiting Circe, and everybody has big fate. And she has like little bits of prophecy that show up that are like, Odysseus is coming to your island. That's what your fate is. He's coming to visit you.
Right, and that's actually in the Odyssey. It was really fun to write that part where Hermes is like, or where she says, "That's the worst prophecy I've ever heard." Like, that's it. No. Yes, exactly. Anyway, sorry.
No, but I just wanted to finish that with just saying that, like, the why are these women so angry kind of thing comes out of, I think so often when you're like working with stories like these, the anger comes out of the fact that the fate is orbiting all around you, and all these guys are saying, I can't help it. And you're the character who's in the margins going, I can help it. I'm was so angry because all of you theoretically could also do some work here, but instead I have to do the work of picking up civilization. Okay, I'm going to do it. And, the stakes stand out from the head, and Demeter goes down to Hades, and, and Circe does all of her intense attempts to make the world work better and to learn to be a witch and to learn how to use her power, and not just to have the power that she came with, like the basic unknown power. She goes underneath the surface and finds her intellect,
Magic from scratch. Yeah.
Well, I think on a craft level, that's part of what makes these projects so exciting, right? Like infusing a fated person with agency and motivations, and convincing the reader that okay, yeah, maybe she's just gonna stay and not be trapped. What would that take, right? What would it take to convince the reader that, this is all coming from a place of desire or a need or being a little fucked up, or whatever the thing is that makes us do what we do, right? Rather than fate with a capital F, which we don't really identify with anymore. And I think that's really so I think your question about anger or feminine rage, right, in that context is actually super interesting, because we're looking at an opportunity, I think, to explore centuries of rage at a kind of fate, at a kind of, because patriarchy is a kind of fate that's being imposed on people who don't get to participate. Right. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a one-line fate. They can't help it, is the fate. The fate that's given to people who aren't men. Like the idea that just men can't help it. Their fate says that they have to do things this way. Patriarchy can't be helped, but yeah, exactly.
And that is the worst prophecy we could ever get.
One-line prophecy.
And I love what you were just saying also about making possibly the not optimal choice, that sometimes agency is not about making the optimal choice. It's about making the mistake and, choosing to find freedom in the choice. Even if, even if there's, so I love the way you put that. It's so interesting what you all are saying about sort of the fate circling around, because I think that's also part of the fun, as you say, about writing about these characters, is that there is so much space around them. And that space is a freedom for us as writers to, yes, their stories are going to have to touch the traditional stories in these particular ways, but in between those touch points, we can do whatever we want. And also we can change those touch points because we're writers. So we don't have to do it that way. But, we can if we want to. So, yes, I totally agree with you. I love these types of projects because they're so exciting and interesting. And I always love a new perspective on a story that I know.
Me too. And then, okay, so then how much more time do we have till audience questions? 15 minutes? Okay, great. So then next, I think I would like to ask about the setting that you're putting all of your characters in, because I feel like especially for the Mare Wife, for Fruit of the Dead, you're creating a setting for them that is kind of out of place from where they were originally. And then for Circe, we're really getting to see a lot more of her island. We're getting to see Aiaia? Yeah, I got it? Okay, cool. We're getting to see her build out and, build her magic from that. But I wanted to ask about when you were creating that setting and seeing your characters interact with that, was there something you really wanted to point out about how they become either more themselves, less themselves, maybe on Hades' island or Rollo's island, and then Dana's mountain that she's in with Gruender for so long? Something about those settings seemed to really resonate with creating the characters as they needed to be by the end of the story.
So, a lot of the setting for my book had to do with plot And, so yes, we are trying to create these characters who have agency, who can make choices, but we have to put roadblocks in their way because, Persephone does kind of have to get stuck.
Yeah.
So an island...
Remake the underworld in modern time.
Right. The island felt convenient in that, it's very hard to get off an island if you don't have a boat or a plane or a helicopter or something. So there was like the plot element, and then there was the sort of larger sort of in a post-capitalist, late capitalist critique element of the book where we're talking about people with private islands, owning parcels of the earth is something that Corey mulls about right in the book. So there was sort of that element. And I also had some experience, working on an island when I was younger, and so I was drawing from my personal experience too. But there's something about the island for me that felt very much like, okay, like we're crossing the body of water. There's a gesture toward the river Styx and Sharon and her boat. She's a female character in my book. And then there's sort of like the plot. There's a lot of sort of technical reasons behind the island for me. I loved both of your settings so much, though. Like I would love to live on Ayaya, and that train station in the mountain. Oh my God, it's so vivid. There's like really vivid settings in these books.
Yeah. I mean, listening to you talk about this, I'm putting together that we have a lot, like our settings have things in common that it hadn't occurred to me that they had in common. Like the idea of the isolated place that still has a thing there that is of the humans, or that's like mine has the train station has been buried underneath the mountain and hidden away. And, but it's an isolated place. It's a place that has there's no access into it. It has to be dug into. And it's the idea of the powerful island is something that I was really just in rereading your books before this panel, I was thinking about about the sort of history of witchcraft writing, the history of you go to the woods to get your power. You go to the woods to get your weapons. Like it runs through kind of everything when we're talking about like, going away from the sort of patriarchal civilization and into a place that's not controlled by them, although hunted in usually by them. But it's interesting. I think in all of our settings, we kind of have that place that has also been invaded by whatever the difficult element in the society is in our story. But like some man is coming through, and he's dangerous and he wants to control the area, but doesn't really want to live in the wild. Like it's interesting because in our civilization, our culture, the idea of the like survivalist masculine person is such a thing. Like the idea of the guy who goes back to the land and like, and in all these stories, it's the women who are doing some of that. And it's interesting to think about that because inadvertent too, but part of the original stories, I think, as well.
I love what you said about going out to find your power. You have to exit the society to find your power. And I was definitely thinking about Virginia Woolf also, and sort of a room of one's own in terms of how writers find their. You kind of have to go to that place where it's just you. So I was thinking a lot about that with Circe and how sometimes exile can set you free from. It can be a gift as well as an attempted punishment. It was really fun to create the island of Ayaya. I mean, one of the things that happened was my editor asked me if I wanted to put a map at the beginning of the book, and I was like, of sort of Odysseus and like all that stuff, and I was like, oh no, like the debates, like no, they're not real places, or if they are, everyone argues about where they are. Like no, I'm not stepping in that. So we decided just to do a picture of the island instead. So because of all those arguments about where Circe's island was, I sort of, in building it, I was kind of like, okay, 25% Greek island, of course, 25% kind of Anatolia, like Black Sea region, because we hear that in Homer, that's sort of where she is. That's where her brother is. So that's kind of where she is. And then like 25%, of course, the Romans claimed her and wanted her over by Italy. So like 25% Amalfi Coast and then like 25% magic. So that was Aiaia. Of course, I had to visit all those places before I got it.
What a chore.
Have you seen the Italian film Stromboli? It's set on one of the Aeolian Islands off the coast of Sicily, and it's just after World War II. It's a woman, probably a Nazi, unclear, gets married to an Italian fisherman and goes to this island with no people, which is a wild place. It's like a volcanic island with a live volcano. It's a real place. And the whole story is her trying to get off the island and trying to get enough power from some aspect of her femininity to get off the island because she's gone crazy and can't function. It's really dark, but like kind of relevant to all of these stories. Like in terms, the film ends with her climbing the volcano, just sort of in a summer dress and with a little suitcase, like she's trying to get to the other side, but really she's climbing the volcano. So she's not getting to the other side. She's getting to the volcano. Mm-hmm. And it was meaningful to watch it. I watched it recently and I was like, yeah, sometimes I guess you just have to fucking go into the volcano. You know? That's what the story. It's the middle of the story. There's more to say here, but you have to go in.
Great, and then adding on to kind of the setting of the story, furthering out kind of how we get to focus on these women, but then we have so much space to widen out and add in myths that kind of surround them. I really love catching those moments in the books, like getting to see one of my favorite from Circe's was Pacify, the mother of the Minotaur. I loved seeing her whole like kind of malicious breakdown that she has with the king, and then Willa in The Mere Wife, who is the mother and then marries Beowulf. I loved seeing her and the chorus of mothers who are like in the background just like, all of your actions are ruled by us. We control everything. You just don't know it. I loved getting the perspective of the mothers. And then also, Sharon, you mentioned her. I loved seeing her tease Hades, because she's just like, I control who gets to come and go from your island, but you're still my boss. But so I wanted to know if there was any character that you were so happy you got to include, or if there was someone that you were like, I just have to like have a moment for them, because as like we were talking about earlier, like there are so many people who are passed over, and they're like, I am always so excited getting to see them and getting them to have their moment.
There is a nymph, Leucippe, who was a lover of Hades and was turned into a poplar tree. And running her into her in my research was really exciting because it gave me this sense of, other research that I'd been doing for the book was much less fun. Like I watched the Harvey Weinstein stuff and like Jeffrey Epstein documentary. It was really unpleasant.
It wasn't traveling in Greece, and
No, not as fun as that. Yeah. But uncovering this ancient predecessor to Persephone was really exciting because it gave me this sense of like a pattern of abuse, right, which is what we see in contemporary stories, right? So that little reference to this nymph, Leucippe, turned into a whole person in the book, Kelly, who preceded Corey on the island as the former babysitter. Right. People keep mistaking her for Kelly and calling her Kelly's name, and she's not quite sure what happened to Kelly until later. But yeah, so that actually was a real open door for me in the research.
And Persephone finds her name on a tree.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
You never know who should go next. All right. Go. No, all right, you can go. Okay. I thought I was going to write a lot more about the dragon in The Mere Wife, the Beowulf dragon, like third act dragon that people for a long time felt like it was a different poem and it got squished together with Beowulf. And what I ended up doing was turning the dragon into Grendel's mother and into the train that's like waiting inside of the mountain, abandoned, has been in there for a long time, just waiting. And the Grendel's mother character, Dana, ends up like driving the train through like she speeds the train into this whole catastrophe of her at all, because I just wanted her to destroy the whole fucking thing. Like, and that was like, luckily I had done that by the time I did the Beowulf translation, because I would have had a lot of trouble with that Beowulf translation had I not been able to have Grendel's mother win, you know, like she doesn't win. And the way that I got her to the place where she doesn't survive but she wins is to have her mash the dragon together with her, which the dragon kills Beowulf, so the dragon also wins in the Beowulf story. Like, the dragon is, and I made the dragon female in my translation because I was able to draw a line through all of the angry and dispossessed women that run through the whole story of Beowulf to the dragon, who to me seemed like someone that was part of the chain of femininity and the chain of like people who've been consistently controlled, who've been consistently attacked. But this one is bigger and has scales and fire. But in the poem, she's described, in my translation, I translated as a something to the effect of like a writhing rainbow coming through the clouds. But that's what is in the original. It's the idea that she is beautiful, but also horrifying, like, but described by the poet with a lot of respect. And there's something about the way the poet describes her and the notion of a respected and dignified and strategic monster that runs through that poem about the dragon that I thought was really satisfying to use in a contemporary translation, and also in the contemporary sort of novelized version of a woman's rage turning her into something superhuman.
Yeah, I love that so much. I mean, there were so many characters that I was really enjoyed writing about. Pasiphae, Circe's sister, the mother of the Minotaur. It's interesting that she is not more prominent in mythology. Her story kind of falls away. Usually when you tell the story of the Minotaur, it's about the Minotaur and it's about Theseus, and sometimes you can put in Ariadne and Minos, and, you know, but like, to be the mother of the Minotaur is a really intense thing. And so I was really excited to sort of develop their relationship. And she begins the novel really as an antagonist to Circe. But part of what I wanted Circe to eventually understand is that, you know, she and her sister are dealing with a lot of the same things. They've just chosen to deal with them in a different way. That Circe goes to her island and retreats, and she's able to have some freedom from that, but she also has to give up a lot of things by going to the island. And Pasiphae wants to live in the world and wield power in the world. And so she chooses a very different strategy for the way she wants to be. She basically decides that the only way to wield power in the world safely as a woman is to terrify everyone around you as much as possible. And so it was really important to me to have her there. I mean, she was just a wonderful counterbalance to Circe's perspective. And then, of course, there's Penelope. I mean, what classics nerd doesn't want to write about Penelope? And so it was really interesting, and in particular, write about her having those conversations with Circe at the end. I mean, that was the carrot that was pulling me through the entire novel, is knowing that friendship was waiting at the end of the novel for me. And Penelope and Circe, by the time we got to the end of the novel, I felt like they had so much in common. These are single parents. They are survivors. They are very complicated women. They are artists. There was just so much there. And so I loved getting to build that friendship and sort of figure out how they would, but they're also different in many ways. I mean, Penelope, like her husband, loves to scheme and, you know, twist things and say one thing and mean another thing. And my Circe, at least as I imagine her, is much more naturally direct. And so it was fun to sort of have that tension between them as well. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think a great thing, too, about bringing in Penelope at the end was we get to see her kind of after Odysseus. We get to see her beyond Odysseus's island, Ithaca, and I think that was great to see her, you know, because I hadn't really seen her outside of that perspective of just Odysseus's wife, because here she is now, she's her own person. You get to see her pushing out of her myth, which I think is really great about retellings, is you get to, like, make them bigger than who they were in the original source, but then you even get to make them bigger than the myth now. Like, they're becoming, like, extending after they're getting retold again and again and again, which is what I love about myth, is that you get to retell it so many times, and I love it every time. But yeah, thank you all so much. I think now it's time for audience questions. Am I correct? Yes, okay.
So open question for all of you, but I wanted to start with Nataly, since we haven't heard about Medusa a lot yet, and just was curious about what drew you to the story and what motivated you to write a whole retelling of it, and kind of, yeah, high level, if any of you have thoughts to chime in on about this, of just what drew you to your story and made you want to retell it.
Yeah, so the main thing about Medusa is, I think we've already talked about it, where you only really get to see a character like Medusa in a couple lines. And maybe she's already beheaded. Maybe she's just a head in Perseus's hand. Maybe she's a monster, but she's about to get beheaded. And so reading those original myths, I was like, okay, but what about before? Like, who was she? And so that is really what drew me to Medusa's myth, especially like before she even met Poseidon, before she even knew who Athena was, who was this character and who was she after when she became this snake-haired Gorgon who can turn people to stone just by looking at them and everyone's terrified of her. Okay, but what did she do in all that time? Like, where was she going? I wanted to know all of that, and that's really what drew me to the myth. I wanted to see who she was as a person, as a monster, as everything, as a girl, and I think, like, as they were all talking about, like, getting to, like, flesh that out, getting to, like, expand their stories, that was such, like, a great feeling and a great honor for me. Just to be able to see her come to life as what, like, I would imagine she would be like beyond just the page.
Hi, so I have a question. Madeline, you talked about those touch points that you kind of feel like you either have to or choose to hit within your myth. And I'm curious as to how you decided which ones did have to be included and versus things that you create on your own. Obviously, there's a lot of space in these stories to create as much as you want, but particularly with Circe, like her exile ending, like how much are you willing to push the touchstones past the original myth?
That's a really good question. And the first question I actually those of us on Zoom can only sort of hear the audience. So that one I could hear. But I mean, I think it really depends on what your project is. So for my first novel, Song of Achilles, I was writing very, very close to the material, and the changes I made tended to be very small because part of what I was trying to do is sort of express that this was a story that was hiding in plain sight. I wanted to like flip the embroidery over and show the back. And so I wanted to write very close to it and not change very much. But with Circe, I wanted to feel like, okay, Odysseus, you've told this story for 3,000 years. Now I disagree. And so I deliberately wanted to change things and push back. And I really feel like that things have to come, like that's the I don't know if it's the muses or, that's the artistic impulses. You have to follow your own impulse there in terms of what supports the story and what doesn't. I mean, there is a myth about Circe turning this guy into a woodpecker. It was not interesting to me. It was out. In some versions of the story, in one lost epic that we have called the Telegony, Penelope ends up married to Telegonus, Circe's son with Odysseus, and Circe marries Telemachus, and they swap sons, and it's really weird and off-putting. And also, my Telegonus was queer, and you know what I mean? And I wanted Penelope's story to end not about what man she was attached to, so you have to sort of follow those artistic impulses. Like, there's no rules. And there were certainly no rules for the ancients when they were adapting. They did whatever they wanted. And so it's been really fun to to give myself permission to make big changes. I mean, I love what you were talking about with the train becoming the dragon, becoming Grendel's, like it all coming together. And those are the types of things that you can really only feel when you're kind of like deep in the work and creating it. Like, where is the heat that I need to go towards?
Yeah, one of the things that I think about when we're working on texts like this is that they've all come from like mixed traditions, like oral traditions of people telling stories for audiences. And in the Beowulf poem, there's obvious evidence of that. Like you can see, like whoever this transcription is, someone is performing the poem and someone is writing it, maybe over several nights. And so there are references to stories that someone in the audience knows, maybe more than one someone, maybe the person who's the host of this evening of poetry and drinking. And so you see the story, the poem is actually evolving in front of you if you look at it that way. And then you can be one of the storytellers that's like changing, that's left turning in the same way that everyone always did, in the same way that in the Homeric tradition, people came in and got grandma stories in there and stuffed in some like little bits of verse from whatever little town that were part of the singing in that town when it was being performed. And it got into, we don't know where the written versions came from, but we know that there are little fragments of little scraps of things that are affiliated with all these stories. They came from different centuries, they came from different storytellers. And so like imagining yourself just as one of those is pretty liberating. Like, cause that's exactly what we are. Where all of us are one of those, one of those kinds of people that come to your town and try to work with what you have in front of you and tell a story that's relevant to the audience at the same time telling the known story that has the big title.
Just that, like, yeah, I think there's some liberation in that concept that it's an imperfect craft and there's no rules. And, I didn't work with as many texts, I think, as certainly as Madeline did, and certainly not as many pages as Maria did. But I was working with only the Homeric hymn to Demeter, and I kept going back to it over and over again. And I felt like, for me, as not coming from a background of classics, for instance, it was really useful to keep my source material incredibly concise. It's only like 3 pages long, and really beautiful. And I kept drawing from it. There was always more to mine. And I found it really, I felt like if I opened up my research any bigger than that, the task would become so overwhelming. I would have to do things like, cut the reference to this or that, or make big choices about, and I wasn't writing, a biopic like Circe, right? It was more like just, nope, this one story, this one version of this one story, and why is it, what does it illuminate about these contemporary people who have slightly different names, behaving right now, so.
Hi. So in at least 2 of your stories, you all mentioned that Athena kind of looms as this threat to the women at the center. And I feel like, we hear a lot in myths about women warring against other women. Oftentimes, like every story we hear about Hera is her being really jealous and punishing another woman because Zeus can't keep it in his pants, right? And it's, the other women generally aren't at fault. And so I'm curious how all of you reckoned with the internalized misogyny that is so bound up in all of these myths in writing these women alongside other women.
Did you guys get that one? About the internalized?
Not as much of it as I wanted to get. Could somebody paraphrase?
The question was about, the internalized misogyny in these myths and how we reckoned with that in the retelling. Yeah. So I was reckoning with it pretty closely. At the opening of my book, you find out that the daughter and the mother have had a falling out because the daughter has told her mother that she was assaulted, and the mother stood up and walked out of the room, did not console her daughter on any level. And so you get that scene from both characters' perspectives. In the daughter's perspective, of course, it feels like the mother has abandoned her, betrayed her, not stood up for her. No charges were filed, etc. From the mother's perspective, you learn that she herself is a victim of assault and has a huge amount of sort of calcified rage and pain that's built up around that difficulty, that's sort of preventing her from feeling sympathy for her daughter. So I was reckoning with this there's a huge amount of rape that happens in ancient stories, and I wanted to talk about it directly. I wanted to talk about not just, inherited trauma and, the legacy of that, but also questions of consent and power dynamics like age, class, socioeconomic status. All of these questions sort of came into it. So I was really talking about that patriarchy element pretty directly.
I was talking a lot about in the Beowulf story. It's a very bro-y. I translated the first line of my Beowulf as bro, because that's how it is. Like the story is like, my boy did this, my boy did that. I'm gonna like beat the monsters and be like the best boy ever. And within that, there are all of these women who are doing things too. But in the story, you don't feel them as much because they don't get the floor. They don't get to talk. Only one woman in the Beowulf poem gets to talk, and it's Willa, who is not Willa. It's what's her name? Wealhtheow, who's Hrothgar's wife. She's the king's wife, and she has a very, very passive aggressive and furious speech, in my opinion. Not in everyone's opinion. Some people think she has the boring speech in Beowulf. Like she talks about, she's a peace weaver. She's like, here's how we do the drinking, and here's my gift to you, Beowulf. And really she's saying, I have power in this room over my husband. I know every warrior in here, and they are mine. Don't try to take the floor, Beowulf. Don't kill my sons. Don't try to take power from my sons, even though my husband is an old man and thinks he's controlling things. I'm actually controlling things. So in my adaptation of that story, I had women who were controlling things from behind the scenes all across it, like intensely controlling things, and sometimes not succeeding, like ending up with big, big sorrow and distress as a result of thinking that they had power that they didn't have. When I was working on that Midwife, I was thinking about the Trump election in 2016 and about all the women that voted for that guy. And to me, inconceivable to vote for him. But to them, he was like, they were voting for establish the normal power structure that they thought would be one that would support women in a comfortable position of safety. Also other reasons, all kinds of terrible reasons, but like that was what they were, I think that's what the universal idea was, the wrongful batshit idea. And so I thought about the way that has run through our societies, like the way that women have supported volatile male figures in an attempt, thinking that they are guaranteeing their safety, when in fact they're lessening their rights, injuring themselves, creating a scenario where they have no safety and other people also have no safety. And you have power, but you're using it for the wrong purpose. I think women aren't universally good. we don't get everything right. And I was interested in, in some of the old stories, of course, there's the misogynist version of that where women are monsters. We're just humans, of course, and humans often make bad mistakes. And so in my story, I wanted to make everybody really human. Like, you fuck up sometimes. You put your loyalty with the wrong side. You vote for the wrong guy. You marry the wrong man. You end up trapped in a situation that you didn't predict. And, all these stories have all of those elements in them too. They're part of the history of everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting how often women are pitted against each other in stories, that if there's two women, they're likely in ancient Greek material to be fighting. And it's been interesting to watch my children encounter Greek mythology because, like me, you want to love Artemis and you want to love Athena. These women are not feminists.
No.
Yeah. And it's really interesting to see how often it's women tearing, in the stories. And so obviously I wanted Circe to have to reckon with her own internalized misogyny. And, I think this whole Scylla episode is all about that. The person she's really angry at is Glaucus. And instead she, has this fight with Scylla. And of course, I was taking a story from Ovid, and I feel like Ovid's portrait of Circe is incredibly flat and sexist. And, so it's interesting to kind of be taking a story and working with that when you're also dealing with like the misogyny of the source material at the same time. But I really wanted Circe to yearn for connection with women, but also have other, like one of the people she tries to connect with is Medea, her niece in some versions of the story, and in my novel. And Medea also, for reasons of what seems like internalized misogyny, rejects that relationship. And she's like, no, I'm with Jason and that's it. And, my whole life and being is focused on that. And, you have nothing I need and there's nothing I can learn from you. And she's kind of burned by that. And she's kind of burned by her childhood. And so she rejects a lot of women over the course of the novel. And she has to kind of come to terms with that internalized misogyny. I hate that story about like the one good woman. Like I can't stand that. That is one of my most like, seeing red responses to things. It's like, oh, this one woman can do it, but everyone else can't. And so part of what was so wonderful having that Penelope friendship coming at the end is that I feel like she finally learns how to make that connection, how to let go of that, how to, understand the way she has played into this misogyny in her life as well as suffered from it, and to sort of step through that. And so I was thinking about it in literally every scene that I wrote for her.
We have time for one more question.
I have a silly ritual question. Husbands are very ritualistic. So when you're born, like writing rituals, like you write in the morning, do you write after a snack? Yes.
Do you want to go first?
Do I want to go first?
Yeah.
Okay. I write on the weekend when it is not my 9 to 5. I put my noise-canceling headphones on. I put on a Legend of Zelda ambiance music playlist. And that is it. I write until I get to 2,000 words, and that's it.
I had a very intense, like, early morning writing ritual with my coffee, and it was like, 5 in the morning and early birds and so on. And then that all went out the window when I had children. And now I just write whenever I can. Do a lot in the Notes app.
Exactly the same as Rachel. I wrote Mere-Wife in like 2.5 weeks. I went to Italy. I took myself to a writer's retreat and I just got it done. Like I wrote all day for 2.5 weeks and had a draft with no one interrupting me because I was on a hilltop with looking out over, no children there, no difficulty in this regard. And since I've had a small child, my child is almost 5 now. It's sort of like he goes to school, but I have to like pull my brain back from the abyss because it's there now. It's like visiting the abyss. It's hanging out. It has to like come back to itself. So, if I'm lucky, I get like an hour of clarity a day maybe. And then in that hour, I try to remember who I am and try to remember what kind of story I actually want to tell, which is more difficult than I would have thought. But also, I've learned lots of things about what interests me and what terrifies me and what delights me having a child at that age. So it's useful, but also the ritual has gotten corrupted.
Yes, totally agree with both of you. My rituals are all gone. I mean, I think the only ritual that really remains to me is I have to write in a darkened room as much as possible, and oftentimes preferably with like a hood kind of creepily pulled, putting blinders on in order to focus completely, because I really need to see it in my head. I'm a very visual writer, and so I can't listen to music. I can't be in a cafe at all. I really need like sensory deprivation for writing.
I want to do that now. Maybe that will work.
So can we all get sensory deprivation hoods?
All good? All right.
Right. Let's give him a big
Nataly.
hand.